The moment her boot hit the dirt, Marjorie Quinn's life ended. The problem was, nobody told her. She thought she was just stepping out of a cramped stagecoach into a dusty Montana town called Silver Rock. She thought she was here for a job, a quiet, respectable position as a governess at the local school, a way to finally stop running from the ghost of a life she'd left behind. She clutched the worn letter in her pocket, the paper soft as a prayer. It was her only hope, a new start where no one knew her name, and no one could judge the quiet desperation in her eyes. The driver called out the town's name, and a shiver that had nothing to do with the evening chill ran down her spine. This was it, the edge of the world, her last chance. But as she took her first breath of sage-scented air, a man's voice cut through the noise of the arriving coach. A voice that sealed her fate before she even knew it was in danger. "Miss Lenora Wickham?" Marjorie froze, one foot still on the coach step. The voice belonged to a handsome, silver-haired man, his face etched with kindness and relief. Behind him, a small crowd was gathering, women in their finest dresses, men with their hats in their hands, all of them looking at her with an impossible amount of hope. This wasn't a welcome for a simple school teacher. This was something else entirely. "Miss Wickham," the man repeated, stepping closer. "I'm Emmett Kane. We've been so worried. Welcome to Silver Rock." She opened her mouth to correct him, to say, "I'm sorry, sir, you have the wrong person. My name is Quinn, Marjorie Quinn." A simple sentence, a few simple words that would have saved her. But before she could utter a single syllable, the town surged forward like a tidal wave. A woman with flour on her hands grabbed her travel bag. Another fussed with the bonnet on her head. The kind-faced man, Emmett, took her arm with a gentleness that stole her breath. "Gideon was about to ride out looking for you," he said, his voice warm with a joy that felt utterly alien. "When the telegraph said you'd missed the morning connection, we all feared the worst." Gideon. The name meant nothing to her. She tried again to speak, to untangle this bizarre, terrifying misunderstanding. "I'm afraid there's been a—" But her voice was a whisper lost in a hurricane of excitement. The woman with the flour-dusted hands, a Mrs. Patterson, was already steering her toward a decorated wagon. "The dress is all ready, dear. Made the adjustments based on the measurements you sent. We've planned the ceremony for sunset, just like you wanted." Her mind snagged on the words. Dress, ceremony, sunset. This wasn't a welcome party. It was a wedding, and she was the bride. Her head spun, the world tilting on its axis. These people, these kind, smiling strangers, believed she was a woman named Lenora Wickham, and they believed she was here to marry a man named Gideon. She felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her chest. She, Marjorie Quinn, a spinster governess who hadn't been courted in a decade, mistaken for a bride. It was a cruel joke, a cosmic error. She had to stop it. She had to tell them the truth. But as they helped her into the wagon, as children ran alongside cheering, as every face she saw beamed with pure, unadulterated happiness for her, the words died in her throat. When was the last time anyone had been this happy to see her? The answer was simple. Never. For one fleeting, insane moment, she let the fantasy wash over her. What if she just didn't correct them? What if, for one single evening, she could be this Lenora Wickham, this woman who was so wanted, so cherished that an entire town turned out to welcome her? She told herself she'd explain later, after the fuss died down, after she could get someone alone and set the record straight without causing a scene. But as the wagon pulled up to a small white church, glowing with candlelight against the dying sun, she knew she was lying to herself. She was stepping into another woman's life, and she had a sinking, terrifying feeling she might never find her way out. The church doors swung open, and a wave of warm, flower-scented air washed over her. It was beautiful, not grand or imposing, just warm, filled with wildflowers and the soft flicker of dozens of candles. She was bustled into a small back room where the dress hung waiting. It was cream-colored silk, elegant in its simplicity, with a row of tiny pearl buttons that shimmered in the lamplight. Mrs. Patterson and two other women descended upon her, their hands moving with gentle efficiency. They helped her out of her dusty traveling clothes and into the cool silk of the wedding gown. It fit like a second skin. A perfect fit, Mrs. Patterson declared, her voice filled with pride. You have such a lovely figure, dear. Margery stared at the woman in the small silvered mirror. The reflection was a stranger. The dress didn't just cover her, it transformed her. The weary lines around her eyes seemed softer. The perpetual downward turn of her mouth almost looked like a smile. For the first time, she didn't look like plain Margery Quinn. She looked beautiful. One of the women pressed a bouquet of wildflowers into her hands. Prairie roses, Indian paintbrush, and sprigs of sage. Gideon picked them himself this morning, the woman whispered conspiratorially. Said he knew you'd prefer something real over those stuffy hothouse flowers. The gesture, so personal and thoughtful, sent a fresh pang of guilt through her. This Gideon, this stranger she was about to marry, had picked these flowers for a woman who didn't exist, for a fantasy he'd built from letters and a photograph. He's waiting for you, Mrs. Patterson said softly, her eyes misty. And I must say, I've never seen a man so full of hope. The church bell began to toll, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated right through the floorboards and into the soles of her feet. It was a final warning, a countdown to a disaster of her own making. They led her to the entrance of the sanctuary. The small congregation turned as one, their faces glowing with shared joy. And there he was, standing at the altar, his back to her. Gideon Kane. He was tall with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his dark suit. He stood perfectly still, a pillar of quiet strength in the flickering candlelight. As the music began and Emmett Kane gently led her down the aisle, he turned, and Marjorie's breath caught in her throat. His face was all sharp angles and harsh lines, weathered by the Montana sun and wind. A thin white scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a dangerous look. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They were the color of a gathering storm, and they held a deep, profound loneliness that she recognized instantly because she saw it in her own reflection every single day. He wasn't smiling. His expression was a carefully controlled mask of neutrality, but as his eyes met hers, she saw a flicker of something else. Not just hope, not just relief. It was a raw, desperate vulnerability, as if he was staking his entire future on this single moment, on this stranger walking toward him. And in that instant, Margery knew two things with absolute certainty. First, that this man had been hurt, badly, and second, that she was about to hurt him a whole lot more. The preacher's voice was a low drone, the words washing over her in a meaningless tide. All she could focus on was the man standing beside her. He never took his eyes off her, but his gaze wasn't soft or romantic. It was intense, searching, as if he were trying to peel back her skin and see the truth of her soul. She felt like an insect pinned under glass. He was comparing her to the woman in the letters, to the photograph he surely kept, and she was coming up short. She could feel it, the slight furrow of his brow, the tightening of his jaw. He was already seeing the cracks in the facade. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, a thick, expectant silence filled the church. This was her chance, her last chance. Speak now, you fool. Tell them. But her voice was trapped, suffocated by the weight of 100 hopeful stares. She couldn't do it. She couldn't be the one to shatter this perfect, beautiful moment. Do you, Gideon Kane, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. His voice was low and steady, a vow spoken with the finality of a judge's sentence. It held no joy, only a grim sense of duty. And do you, Lenora Wickham? The preacher's voice turned to her, kind and patient. Her real name screamed in her mind. Margery! My name is Margery! She opened her mouth, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought the truth would finally come out. But what emerged was a strangled whisper, a ghost of a sound that was not her own. I do. The lie hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Gideon's hands were cool as he slipped a ring on her finger. It was a simple gold band, worn smooth with time. Sarah's ring. The name of his first wife, the woman lost to fever, echoed in her memory from the whispers she'd overheard outside. She wasn't just replacing a mail-order bride. She was stepping into the shoes of a dead woman? The thought was so horrifying it made her feel faint. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced, and the world slowed to a crawl. Gideon stepped closer. His hands came up to frame her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. He wasn't looking at her with affection. He was looking at her with a chilling, unreadable scrutiny. Then his lips met hers. The kiss was brief, chaste, and utterly devoid of passion. It wasn't a celebration. It was a contract being sealed. As they turned to face the cheering crowd, she chanced to look at her new husband. The mask was back in place, but she saw it again in his stormy eyes. Doubt, suspicion, and a flicker of profound disappointment. He knew. He didn't know how he knew, but he knew. She wasn't the woman he was expecting. The reception at the Kane Ranch was a blur of smiling faces and well-wishes that felt like accusations. The house was simple and stark, scrubbed clean but lacking any warmth. It felt like a place where people didn't laugh much. Marjorie found herself seated beside Gideon, a chasm of silence between them as the town celebrated their union. Everyone told stories about Gideon, painting a picture of a man broken by grief. "Lost his first wife, Sarah, 3 years back," an elderly woman confided, patting Marjorie's hand. "The influenza. Took her in a matter of days. Gideon hasn't been the same since. He needs you, dear, to bring the light back into this house." But every time she glanced at him, all she saw were shadows. He spoke when spoken to, a polite but distant host. He never looked at her. It was as if she were a ghost at her own wedding feast. Later, the fiddle music started, and a few couples began to dance. Gideon stood abruptly. "I should see to the stock," he said, his voice flat. He was running, escaping her. But his father, Emmett, clapped him on the shoulder. "Nonsense, son. You'll do no such thing. Dance with your wife." The command was gentle but firm. Gideon's jaw tightened, but he turned to Marjorie and offered a stiff, formal hand. "I must warn you," he said, his voice a low rumble, meant only for her. "I am not much of a dancer." It wasn't an apology, it was a warning. As he led her onto the makeshift dance floor, his hand felt like a brand on her back, his grip firm and impersonal. They moved together in a stiff, awkward rhythm, a universe of space between them. The town saw a newly married couple. She felt like a prisoner being led to the gallows. "You're different than I expected," he said, his voice so quiet she barely heard him over the music. A spike of pure terror shot through her. "Different how?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. He looked down at her then, his storm cloud eyes finally meeting hers. "Your letters, they were direct, confident." He paused, searching for the right word. "Practical. You wrote of wanting a partnership, of understanding the harsh realities of ranch life. You seemed strong." The unspoken accusation hung between them. "And you are not." "And what am I now?" she dared to ask. His gaze swept over her, taking in the borrowed dress, the frightened look in her eyes. "Fragile," he said finally. The word was a verdict, a judgment. "Like you might break." He didn't say it with tenderness. He said it with a chilling note of annoyance, as if her perceived weakness was a liability he hadn't budgeted for. The music ended, and he dropped her hand as if it were a hot coal. "Excuse me," he muttered, and then he was gone, melting into the shadows at the edge of the firelight, leaving her alone in the middle of the celebration, her heart turning to a block of ice. She spent the rest of the evening making polite conversation, the smile on her face feeling like a porcelain mask that might crack at any moment. She learned more about the Kane family and fragments of gossip and praise. She learned that Gideon's younger brother, Silas, lived with them, but hadn't spoken a word since his mother died 2 years prior. A silent, watchful boy who was nowhere to be seen tonight. The silence of the house suddenly felt more ominous. This wasn't just a house of grief, it was a house of secrets. As the guests began to leave, Emmett found her on the porch, staring out at the vast, star-drowned darkness. "Don't you mind Gideon," he said kindly, misinterpreting her fear as bridal nerves. "He's built walls around his heart so thick, I'm not sure he remembers how to let anyone in. He loves Sarah something fierce. Her loss, it broke something in him." Be patient with him, my dear. Patience. She wanted to laugh. She didn't have the luxury of patience. She had a stolen name and a borrowed life that was unraveling with every passing second. Later, Gideon showed her to her room. Her room, not theirs. It was a small Spartan space with a narrow bed and a single window. The bathroom is at the end of the hall, he said, his voice formal, distant. He stood in the doorway, a formidable silhouette against the lamplight. I trust you have everything you need. Yes, she whispered. Thank you. He just nodded, his eyes unreadable. Sleep well, Lenora. He said the name, her false name, and it felt like a slap. Then he turned and walked to his own room, closing the door behind him with a quiet, final click. Marguerite stood in the suffocating silence, the lies she had told now a physical cage built around her. She wasn't just an imposter. She was an unwelcome intruder in the house of a grieving, angry man who already resented her for not being the woman he'd bargained for. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow I have to find a way out. But as she heard the lonely call of a coyote from the distant hills, she knew it wasn't going to be that simple. She had walked into a trap and the door had just swung shut behind her. Morning light sliced through the thin curtains, and for a blissful, disoriented moment, Marguerite forgot where she was. Then it all came crashing back. The wedding, the lie, the cold, impenetrable man down the hall who was now her husband. She dressed in her own plain traveling clothes, the only practical things she owned. The silk wedding dress felt like a costume from a nightmare. She crept out of her room and followed the smell of coffee to the kitchen. The house was even starker in the daylight, clean to the point of being sterile. There were no pictures on the walls, no knickknacks on the shelves. It was a house that held its breath. Gideon was already there, leaning against the counter, a mug in his hand. He was dressed for work, and in the morning light, he looked even more intimidating. The scar over his eye seemed more pronounced, the lines around his mouth deeper. He didn't say, "Good morning." He just nodded at her, his eyes sweeping over her plain dress with a flicker of something she couldn't decipher. Disapproval? Or maybe, just maybe, relief that she didn't look like the fragile doll from last night. "I can cook," she said, the words rushing out of her, desperate to fill the oppressive silence. "I'd like to make breakfast if that's all right." She needed something to do, a task to ground her. She needed to prove she wasn't the fragile, useless creature he thought she was. He gave a curt shrug. "This is your house now. Do as you please." Your house now. The words were a mockery. She moved around the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she searched for pans and utensils. Everything was meticulously organized. Sarah's kitchen. She felt like a trespasser, disturbing a shrine. She cracked eggs into a bowl, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "You don't have to take care of me," Gideon said from behind her, his voice making her jump. "I've been managing on my own for a long time." It wasn't an offer of help, it was a dismissal. "I don't need you." She didn't turn around. "I'm not doing it for you," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. "I'm doing it because it's what I do. I take care of people." She didn't know where the defiance came from, but it felt good. A small spark of the real Marguerite in this house of lies. They ate in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. She'd made biscuits and gravy, a simple, hearty meal. Gideon ate every last bite, but he never said a word. He just ate with a grim efficiency, his eyes fixed on his plate. When he was done, he stood and took his plate to the wash basin. "I have work to do," he said, already turning for the door. "Wait," she said, her voice small. "Your brother, Silas. I'd like to meet him." Gideon froze, his back to her. For a long moment, he didn't move. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. "He's in the barn. He prefers the animals to people." Another warning. Another wall. "He doesn't speak," Gideon added, his voice dropping even lower. "So don't expect a warm welcome." He left without another word, the screen door slamming shut behind him. Marjorie sank onto a chair, the bravado from earlier draining away, leaving her hollow and afraid. She was trapped in a silent house with a silent boy, and a man who looked at her with nothing but contempt. She had to get out. But how? She had no money, no allies, and nowhere to go. She was utterly, completely alone. She found Silas in the barn, tucked away in a stall with a newborn calf. He was a younger, softer version of Gideon, with the same dark hair and stormy gray eyes. But where Gideon's face was a mask of stone, Silas's was an open book of sorrow. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wide with a wild, skittish fear, like a cornered animal. He scrambled to his feet, putting the calf between them as a shield. "Hello, Silas," she said, keeping her voice low and gentle, the way she would with a frightened child. "I'm Lenora." The false name tasted like ash in her mouth. He didn't respond. He just stared at her, his gaze intense and unnervingly perceptive. It was the same searching look Gideon had given her, but in the boy's eyes it was mixed with a deep-seated suspicion. He knew. Just like his brother, he knew something was wrong. "That's a beautiful calf," she tried again, taking a slow step forward. He flinched, pulling back deeper into the shadows of the stall. She stopped. This wasn't working. She was an invader here, a threat. She changed tactics. She ignored him, turning her attention to the calf. She knelt in the hay, her worn dress getting dirty, and held out a hand. "Hello there," she murmured to the animal. "Aren't you a sweet thing?" The calf, emboldened, took a wobbly step forward and nuzzled her palm. Marjorie smiled, a real, genuine smile for the first time in what felt like years. And then she heard it, a small rustling sound. She looked up. Silas was still watching her, but the fear in his eyes had been replaced by a flicker of curiosity, and he was holding something, a charcoal pencil and a small worn sketchbook. His eyes darted from her face to the page and back again. He was drawing her. The silent boy, the one who kept the world at a distance, was capturing her image. The realization sent a chill down her spine. What was he seeing? The imposter? The liar? Or just a lonely woman finding comfort with a newborn animal? He finished with a few quick strokes. Then without a word he tore the page from the book, slid it across the hay-strewn floor toward her, and retreated back into the shadows. Her hand trembled as she picked up the paper. She expected a crude sketch, a child's drawing. But it wasn't. It was exquisite. He had a true artist's hand. He'd captured her perfectly, the sadness in her eyes, the weary set of her shoulders. But that wasn't what made her blood run cold. He had drawn her, but behind her, looming like a ghost, was the faint, ethereal outline of another woman. A woman with sharper features, a more confident smile, and harder eyes. And at the bottom of the page, he'd written a single shaky word. Where? It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. He wasn't asking who she was. He was asking where the other one was. The real Lenora. This silent, broken boy wasn't just grieving. He was a gatekeeper, a silent witness who knew she was a fraud. And he had just let her know, in no uncertain terms, that he was watching her. The drawing became her secret tormentor. She hid it in the bottom of her travel bag, but she couldn't escape the image. The ghost woman behind her, the single damning word. Silas was a walking, breathing time bomb. He avoided her after that, melting into the background whenever she entered a room. But she could always feel his eyes on her, watching, waiting. Her life settled into a strange, tense rhythm. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended the small, neglected garden behind the house. She threw herself into the work, trying to make herself indispensable, trying to earn her keep in this life she had stolen. It was a penance. Every scrubbed floor, every mended shirt was an apology she couldn't speak aloud. Gideon remained a cold, distant planet in her orbit. They shared meals in suffocating silence. He worked from sunup to sundown, pushing himself with a relentless, punishing energy as if trying to outrun his own demons. The only time he spoke to her was to give clipped instructions or ask perfunctory questions. He never used her name, her false name, again. He simply called her you. One afternoon, desperate for a reprieve from the oppressive silence of the house, she decided to clean out the small study at the end of the hall. It was Gideon's room, filled with ledgers and maps, but it felt unused, coated in a fine layer of dust. As she was cleaning an old roll-top desk, her fingers brushed against a small, hidden latch, a secret drawer. Her heart hammered. She knew she shouldn't. It was a violation. but she was desperate to understand the man she'd married, the woman she was supposed to be. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a small velvet-lined box. She lifted the lid, and there she was, Lenora Wickham. It was a photograph, a formal studio portrait. The woman was beautiful, but in a severe, sharp-edged way. Her chin was high, her smile was a thin, controlled line, and her eyes held a glint of steel. This was the woman from Silas's drawing, the woman Gideon had been expecting. Underneath the photo was a stack of letters, tied with a blue ribbon. Lenora's letters. She read the first one, her stomach twisting into a knot. The words were just as Gideon had described. Confident, direct, practical. But they were also cold, demanding. Lenora wrote of the ranch not as a home, but as an investment. She had detailed plans for expansion, for firing the current ranch hands, for selling off certain bloodlines of horses. She spoke of their marriage as a business merger, a calculated step to secure her own future. There was no warmth, no affection, just ambition. This was the strong woman Gideon thought he was getting, a partner who would run his life with the same ruthless efficiency as a railroad baron. No wonder he looked at Marjorie, with her soft heart and quiet ways, and saw only a fragile liability. He hadn't just been expecting a different woman, he had been expecting a different species. And the worst part? As she read on, she realized Lenora's plan might have worked. Gideon's ranch was barely staying afloat. The ledgers showed mounting debts, falling cattle prices. He was on the verge of losing everything. He hadn't just been looking for a wife, he had been looking for a savior. And he'd gotten her instead. Just as she was placing the last letter back in the box, a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. Gideon! He stood there, his face like a thundercloud, his eyes fixed on the open box in her hands. He didn't have to say a word. The fury rolling off him was a physical force. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. I I was cleaning," she stammered, her hands fumbling with the letters. "I didn't mean to pry." "Liar!" he hissed, stalking into the room. He snatched the box from her, his fingers brushing hers, and the contact was like an electric shock. "You've been a liar since the moment you stepped off that coach." Her blood ran cold. He knew. This was it, the confrontation she had been dreading. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, backing away until her legs hit the edge of the desk. "Don't you?" He slammed the box down on the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "You're not her. You're not the woman who wrote these letters. I've known it since I saw you in the church. I just didn't want to believe it." He advanced on her, backing her against the desk until she had nowhere left to run. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of leather and sweat and rage. "Every word in these letters is about strength, ambition, a will of iron. And I look at you, and all I see is fear. So tell me." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Who in the hell are you?" She stared into his stormy eyes, her own secrets swirling in the depths of his anger. She should tell him. She should confess everything and accept the consequences. But as she looked at his face, contorted with betrayal and a pain so deep it scared her, she realized something else. He wasn't just angry about the lie. He was angry at himself, for being fooled, for allowing himself a flicker of hope that had been immediately extinguished. And in that moment, she made a choice. It was a terrible, reckless choice, born of fear and a strange, new protective instinct she didn't understand. She lied again. "I am Lenora," she insisted, forcing a strength into her voice she didn't feel. "Perhaps I am not what you expected. Perhaps the journey changed me. Or perhaps," she looked him straight in the eye, "you are not the man I expected either." His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise cutting through the anger. No one had ever challenged him like this. Not since Sarah. The mention of his first wife was a ghost in the room, unspoken but ever present. He held her gaze for a long, tense moment, the air crackling between them. He was searching her face, looking for the lie. She held her breath, praying he wouldn't see it. Finally, with a sound of disgust, he straightened up and turned away. "Get out of my study," he said, his voice cold and flat. "And don't ever touch my things again." She fled, her legs shaking, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She hadn't been exposed. Not yet. But she had done something far worse. She had picked a fight. She had poked the bear. And as she hid in her room, listening to the sound of him pacing back and forth in the study like a caged animal, she knew she had just made her situation infinitely more dangerous. The next few days were a living nightmare. The cold silence between them was replaced by a taut, simmering hostility. Every shared meal was a battle of wills, every accidental touch in a narrow hallway an electric shock. Gideon watched her constantly, his eyes filled with a corrosive suspicion. He was waiting for her to slip up, to reveal the truth he already knew in his gut. Her only moments of peace were spent in the barn or the garden, away from the suffocating tension of the house. She found solace in the simple, honest work. The animals didn't judge her. The earth didn't care what her name was. One afternoon, while she was weeding the vegetable patch, a rider approached the ranch. He was a big man with a florid face and eyes that were too small and too close together. He reined in his horse and looked down at her, a contemptuous sneer on his face. "Well, well, you must be the new Mrs. Kane." His tone was oily, insulting. "Jedediah Thorne," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "I own the spread north of here." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Marguerite said, getting to her feet and wiping her hands on her apron. "I doubt that," Thorne said with a chuckle. "Nothing about the Kanes is a pleasure, especially that husband of yours. A man with a temper like a rattlesnake and a soul as black as pitch." The venom in his words was startling. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marguerite said coldly. "Oh, I think you do. Or you will. A pretty little thing like you. You'd best watch your step. This place has a habit of chewing up delicate women." His eyes flickered toward the house, a cruel and knowing light in them. "Just ask Sarah." The name hit her like a physical blow. Before she could respond, Gideon came striding out of the barn, his face a mask of thunder. "Thorne!" he barked. "Get off my land!" Thorne just laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "Just welcoming your new bride to the neighborhood, Kane? Giving her some friendly advice." "She doesn't need advice from you," Gideon growled, stopping beside Marjorie, positioning himself between her and the other man. "Now get out, before I make you." The threat was real. The air hummed with a violence that made the hairs on Marjorie's arms stand up. Thorne's smile faded. He gave Gideon a look of pure hatred, then turned his sneer back on Marjorie. "You heard the man. Enjoy your new home." He spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a poisonous silence in his wake. "Stay away from him," Gideon said, his voice tight with a rage he was struggling to control. "He's trouble." "He said," Marguerite started, her voice trembling slightly. "He mentioned Sarah." Gideon's whole body went rigid. "What did he say about my wife?" he demanded, rounding on her, his eyes blazing. He implied that something happened to her, that it wasn't just the fever." "He's a liar," Gideon snapped. "He wanted this land. He tried to get my father to sell for years. When that didn't work, he spread rumors, vicious lies." He was breathing heavily, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Sarah died of influenza. The doctor said so. That's the end of it." He stared at her, his expression daring her to question him. But she could see the flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow of pain, of guilt, that hadn't been there before. Jedediah Thorne hadn't just been making idle threats. He had been planting a seed of doubt, a poisonous little seed that was now taking root in the fertile ground of her own fear and uncertainty. Was Gideon telling the truth, or was he hiding a secret even darker than her own? That night she couldn't sleep. Thorne's words echoed in her mind. "Just ask Sarah." She crept out of her room and down the silent hallway to the study. The door was ajar. A single lamp was burning, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Gideon was there, slumped over the desk, a bottle of whiskey and a single glass beside him. He wasn't drinking. He was just staring at something in his hands. The velvet box. He had the photograph of Lenora out, but beside it, he'd placed another, older photograph. A smiling woman with kind eyes and hair the color of corn silk. Sarah. He was talking to her, his voice a low, broken whisper. I should have protected you, he murmured, his fingers tracing the outline of her face. It's my fault. It's all my fault. Marjorie shrank back into the shadows of the hallway, her heart breaking for him. The grief, the guilt. It was a physical presence in the room, so thick she could barely breathe. Whatever had happened to Sarah, he blamed himself. Suddenly, the floorboard under her foot creaked. Gideon's head snapped up, his eyes instantly alert, the grief replaced by a flash of anger at being caught in a moment of weakness. Their eyes met across the dimly lit room. He looked at her, then down at the two photographs on his desk, the wife he had lost and the wife he had been promised. And then his gaze lifted back to her, the imposter who was neither. And the look on his face was one of utter, soul-crushing despair. In that moment, she wasn't a liar or a fraud. She was just the living, breathing embodiment of all his failures. After that night, something shifted. The simmering hostility between them cooled into a resigned, weary truce. It was as if seeing him at his most vulnerable had stripped away her fear, and being seen had stripped away some of his anger. They were two broken people, trapped in a lie, circling each other's pain. He started leaving a cup of coffee for her on the stove in the mornings. She started leaving a plate of food for him on the table when he worked late. Small, silent gestures of care. They didn't talk, but they began to exist in the same space without the constant, crackling tension. And as the tension eased with Gideon, something remarkable began to happen with Silas. He started leaving his drawings for her, not just of animals, but of scenes from the ranch. Gideon mending a fence, Marjorie hanging laundry on the line, small, quiet moments of their life, captured with his exquisite, heartbreaking detail. It was his way of speaking, his way of letting her in. One evening, she found him in the front room, his hands hovering over the keys of an old dust-covered piano. It was Sarah's piano, she realized. It hadn't been played in years. It's beautiful, she said softly, not wanting to scare him away. He flinched but didn't run. I used to play, he whispered, his voice rusty from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken to her, the first time in 2 years he had spoken a full sentence to anyone. Marjorie's heart swelled. Would you play for me? She asked gently. He hesitated, then his fingers found the keys, and a simple, haunting melody filled the silent house. It was a sad song, full of longing and loss, but it was beautiful. She sat beside him on the bench, and when he finished, she started to hum a tune from her own childhood. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. Do you know it? She asked. He shook his head. I can teach you. And so began their ritual. Every evening, they would sit at the piano together. He would play, and she would sing. The music began to chase the shadows from the corners of the house, filling it with a warmth it hadn't known in years. Gideon would often stand in the doorway and listen, his expression unreadable. She didn't know if the music brought him comfort or pain, a reminder of the wife he'd lost. But he never told them to stop. One night, after a particularly beautiful song, Silas turned to her, his face serious. Sarah taught me that one, he said quietly. She loved to sing. He looked toward the doorway, where Gideon had been listening just moments before. He misses her music, Silas said. He misses her. It was the first time any of them had spoken Sarah's name without flinching. It was a turning point, a small crack in the wall of grief that had encased the Kane family for 3 long years. She was beginning to feel something dangerous. Hope. She was falling in love with this broken family, with this silent house, with the sad, angry man who was her husband. She knew it was a fool's errand. She knew it was all built on a lie that could crumble at any moment. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged somewhere. The illusion of peace was shattered by the arrival of a telegram. The messenger boy rode up in a cloud of dust, his face grim. Gideon took the yellow envelope, his face paling as he read the message inside. He stood frozen in the yard for a long moment, the paper trembling in his hand. Then he looked up and his eyes found her, watching from the kitchen window. The expression on his face was not anger. It was not betrayal. It was a cold, quiet dread. He walked into the house, his steps heavy, and held the telegram out to her without a word. Her hands shook so badly she could barely read the words. It wasn't from a matrimonial agency. It was from Lenora Wickham herself. Gideon Kane. Stop. My apologies for the delay. Stop. Father took ill in St. Louis. Stop. Recovering now. Stop. Will arrive Silver Rock on the 15th. Stop. Your bride, Lenora. The 15th. That was in 3 days. The world tilted, the floor dropping out from beneath her. This was so much worse than she could have ever imagined. The real Lenora hadn't eloped. She wasn't gone. She was coming. The woman from the photograph, the author of those cold, ambitious letters, was on her way to claim her life. Her husband. Her ranch. So, Gideon said, his voice terrifyingly calm, it seems we have a problem. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not just suspicion, but a chillingly clear understanding. He finally knew the full scope of her deception. You have 3 days, he said, his voice as flat and final as a tombstone. 3 days to be gone. When she arrives, I want no trace of you here. Do you understand? He wasn't yelling. He wasn't accusing. It was worse. He was erasing her. She was a temporary problem to be disposed of before the real owner arrived. A ghost to be exorcised from his house. And as he turned and walked away, she realized the terrible truth. The trap hadn't been marrying him. The trap was that she had fallen in love with him. And in 3 days she would have to walk away and disappear forever. That night the house was quieter than it had ever been. It was a dead, suffocating silence, the kind that comes after a fatal diagnosis. Marjorie packed her small bag, her movements slow and robotic. Her own dress, a few meager belongings. She left the wedding ring, Sarah's ring, on the nightstand. It had never been hers. She felt a phantom pain in her finger where it had been. Every sound in the house was magnified. The creak of the floorboards as Gideon paced his room. The distant, mournful sigh of the wind. She was a ghost already, haunting the final hours of her own life. She had to leave. She knew she had to leave. But where would she go? Back to being a governess, invisible and alone? The thought was unbearable. She had tasted what it felt like to be part of a family, to be needed, to be loved. No, he didn't love her. He was just beginning to tolerate her. But Silas had started to live again because of her. The thought of leaving him, of him retreating back into his silence, was a physical pain. She was staring out her window at the moonlit prairie when a small slip of paper was pushed under her door. She picked it up. It was a drawing from Silas. It depicted 3 figures, a man, a woman, and a boy, standing together on the porch of the ranch, watching the sunset. They were holding hands. It was them, the family she had pretended to be a part of. Underneath the drawing were 2 words, written in his careful, hesitant script. Don't go. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. She couldn't leave him, but she couldn't stay. She was trapped between an impossible choice and a heartbreaking reality. She was still clutching the drawing when she heard a noise from the study, a crash of glass, followed by a low, guttural cry of anguish. She ran down the hall. The door was open. Gideon was standing in the middle of the room, his hand bleeding. He had swept everything off his desk. The ledgers, the inkwell, the lamp. The framed photograph of Sarah lay shattered on the floor. Gideon! She cried, rushing to his side. He flinched away from her touch, his breathing ragged. Don't, he choked out, turning his face away from her. Just leave me alone. You're bleeding, she said, ignoring him. She gently took his hand, pulling a handkerchief from her apron pocket and pressing it against the gash on his palm. His skin was hot, his whole body trembling with a rage that was directed inward. It's my fault, he whispered, the same broken words she'd heard him speak to Sarah's photograph. All of it. What's your fault? She asked softly, her fingers tightening around his hand. He finally looked at her, his eyes wild with a pain that was more than just grief. Sarah, he said, his voice cracking, I killed her. The confession hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Marjorie's blood turned to ice. Jedediah Thorne's sneering face flashed in her mind. Just ask Sarah. It wasn't a rumor. It was the truth. What are you saying? She stammered, her hand instinctively pulling away from his. "We had a fight," he said, his voice a dead monotone as he stared at the shattered picture on the floor. "The worst fight we'd ever had. Thorne had been sniffing around, trying to buy the water rights. I told her to stay away from him. She was too trusting, too kind. She said I was being paranoid, controlling." He ran his uninjured hand through his hair, his body shaking. "I got angry. I yelled. I said things. Terrible things. She ran out of the house into the cold. Said she needed air. That night, the fever took her. It came on so fast. The doctor said it was the influenza, that it was sweeping the county. But I know the truth. I drove her out into the cold. I weakened her spirit. I broke her heart. And then the fever took what was left." He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. Marguerite stood frozen, her mind reeling. He hadn't physically harmed her, but in his own mind, his guilt was just as profound. He was a man drowning in a grief so deep he had convinced himself he was a monster. He believed he had killed the woman he loved with his own anger. She looked at this powerful, formidable man, now completely broken, and felt a wave of overwhelming compassion wash away her fear. She knelt in front of him, among the broken glass, and gently pulled his hands away from his face. "Gideon, look at me," she said, her voice firm but gentle. He raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed and lost. "You didn't kill her," she said. "A fever killed her. Your words didn't make her sick. Your love for her didn't fail. You are not a murderer. You are a man who has carried a burden that was never his to bear." He stared at her, his breath catching in his throat. In his eyes she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before. Not suspicion, not anger, not even tolerance. It was a fragile, desperate hope, as if her words were a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. He reached out, his hands shaking, and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was feather-light, hesitant. It wasn't the touch of a husband or a stranger or a captor. It was the touch of a man seeing a woman for the very first time. And in that moment, the lie that separated them, the name, the deception, it all melted away. All that was left were two lonely souls, finding a flicker of solace in a shared, impossible darkness. The moment was shattered by a sound from the doorway. Silas. He stood there, his face pale as a ghost, his sketchbook clutched in his hands. He was trembling from head to toe. He hadn't just heard their words. He had seen the touch. He had seen the look that passed between them. And the expression on his face was not one of relief or happiness. It was one of pure, abject terror. He took one look at Gideon's hand on Marguerite's face, and then he turned and ran, his bare feet slapping against the wooden floors as he fled into the night. "Silas!" Gideon yelled, jolting to his feet. They ran after him, out onto the porch and into the cold, moonless night. He was just a small, fleeing shadow, heading for the darkness of the open prairie. "He's running from me," Gideon said, his voice raw with a fresh wave of pain. "He saw me. He thinks I'm a monster." "No," Marguerite said, grabbing his arm. "He's not running from you. He's running from us. He's afraid for me." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Silas's fear, his silence. It wasn't just about his mother's death. It was about Sarah's. "Gideon, what did Silas see?" she asked, her voice urgent. "The fight you had with Sarah. Was he there?" Gideon's face went slack with a dawning horror. He was in his room. The door was open. He must have heard everything. Of course. The boy hadn't just lost his mother. Weeks later, he'd overheard a violent argument, and then his beloved sister-in-law had died. In his traumatized mind, the events were linked. His brother's anger equaled death, and now he had seen that same anger directed at Marguerite, followed by a moment of terrifying tenderness. He thought history was repeating itself. He wasn't just protecting a secret. He was trying to prevent another tragedy. He was trying to save her. They found him huddled in the barn, hidden in the loft, his sketchbook clutched to his chest like a shield. He had it open to a new drawing, a frantic, terrifying sketch. It showed a large, shadowy figure, Gideon, standing over a smaller weeping woman, Sarah. But there was a third figure in the drawing, one Silas had never drawn before. A man with small, cruel eyes lurking in the background. Jedediah Thorne. "Silas!" Gideon said, his voice choked with emotion as he climbed the ladder into the loft. "Son, what is this? What did you see?" Silas didn't speak. He just stabbed a finger at the drawing, his eyes wide with a desperate urgency. He pointed at Thorne, then at Sarah, then at Gideon. He was trying to tell them something, the real story, the one he had locked away behind a wall of silent terror for 3 years. The fight wasn't just about paranoia. Thorne hadn't just been spreading rumors. He had been on the property. He had been threatening Sarah. Gideon's argument with his wife hadn't been an attack. It had been a desperate plea for her to stay away from a dangerous man. "He was here," Gideon whispered, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "Thorne was here that day. I saw his horse riding away after she ran out." His guilt hadn't been misplaced. It had just been misdirected. He wasn't guilty of killing her with his anger. He was guilty of failing to protect her from a predator. At that moment, they heard the sound of approaching horses, not one but several, riding hard. A flicker of lantern light appeared at the end of the long ranch road. "Who is that?" Marjorie breathed. Gideon's face hardened, the grief momentarily replaced by a cold, protective fury. "Thorne," he said. "He's come to finish what he started." He grabbed an old rifle from the wall of the barn. "Marjorie, take Silas. Get in the house and lock the doors. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not leaving you." He looked at her, and in the dim lantern light, she saw a flicker of awe in his eyes. He had expected a fragile doll, and instead he'd found a woman made of steel. The riders burst into the yard, Thorne at their head. "Cain," he bellowed, "I hear you're expecting company tomorrow. A new bride. Thought I'd come by and make sure the place was ready for her. Wouldn't want her to trip over any old baggage." His eyes found Marjorie, and his lips curled into a vicious sneer. "This doesn't concern her, Thorne," Gideon said, his voice lethally calm as he stepped out of the barn, the rifle held loosely at his side. "This is between you and me." "Oh, I think it concerns her," Thorne said, dismounting. "See, I came to make you an offer. You sign over the deed to your land, and I'll let you and your little imposter ride out of here with your lives, a generous offer considering." "How did you know?" Marjorie whispered. Thorne laughed. "The telegraph operator's a cousin of mine. He told me about the message days ago, about the real Lenora Wickham. I've just been waiting for the right moment to use it." He was a snake as coiling for the final strike. He had planned it all, to expose her, to ruin Gideon, and to take the ranch. "It was you," Gideon said, his voice a low growl. "You were the one who drove Sarah into that fever. You threatened her." Thorne's face darkened. She was a fool. Like all women, she wouldn't listen to reason, so she ran out into the cold. Her own fault, really. It was a confession, a casual, monstrous admission. And in that moment, something inside Silas broke. A guttural scream tore from his throat, a sound of pure, undiluted rage that had been silenced for years. "You liar!" he shrieked, scrambling down from the loft. Everyone froze, stunned by the sound of his voice. "You pushed her!" Silas screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Thorne. "I saw you! You grabbed her arm! She fell! You left her there in the snow!" The truth, the real, terrible truth, finally came out. Sarah hadn't just run out into the cold. Thorne had confronted her, assaulted her. She had fallen and hit her head. He had left her there, injured and exposed to die. It wasn't influenza. It was murder. Thorne's face went pale, then contorted with rage. He drew his pistol. "Shut up, you little brat!" But it was too late. Gideon moved, faster than she could have imagined, the rifle coming up to his shoulder. A single shot cracked through the night air. Thorne cried out, clutching his shoulder as his pistol clattered to the ground. His hired men, seeing their leader fall, turned and fled into the darkness. They stood in the sudden, ringing silence of the aftermath. Thorne, wounded and exposed. Silas, trembling but standing tall, his voice finally freed by the truth. And Gideon, the rifle still smoking in his hands, looking not at the man he had shot, but at Marguerite. In his eyes was a universe of gratitude, of regret, of a love that had been born in the crucible of lies and loss. The law arrived with the dawn, summoned by one of the fleeing ranch hands. They took Thorne away, his crimes finally brought to light by the boy who had been too afraid to speak. As the sun rose, casting a clean, golden light over the ranch, a lone wagon appeared on the horizon. The morning stage. The real Lenora Wickham had arrived. She was exactly like her photograph, tall, severe, dressed in a perfectly tailored traveling suit that hadn't a speck of dust on it. She surveyed the scene, the lingering presence of the sheriff, the bloodstain in the dirt, the exhausted but united family standing on the porch, with a look of cold distaste. Gideon met her at the gate. They spoke for a long time, his voice low and calm, hers sharp and clipped. Marjorie watched from the porch, her heart in her throat, Silas's hand held tight in hers. This was it, the end of the story. Finally, Gideon reached into his pocket and handed Lenora a thick wad of cash. She counted it, her face impassive, then nodded once. Without another word, without a single backward glance, she climbed back into the wagon and rode away, disappearing as quickly as she had arrived. She hadn't wanted a husband, she had wanted a business. And when the business proved to be messy and unprofitable, she simply cashed out. Gideon walked back to the porch, his steps lighter than she had ever seen them. He stopped in front of her, the morning sun at his back. He looked from her to Silas, his stormy eyes soft with an emotion she was only now beginning to understand. "Well," he said, a slow, weary smile spreading across his face, "it seems I am in need of a wife." He looked directly at Marjorie, and the love in his gaze was so powerful it stole her breath. "But this time," he continued, his voice dropping, "I have some very specific requirements. She must be kind. She must be brave. She must have a gift for healing broken things. And she absolutely must not be named Lenora." Marjorie laughed through her tears, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "I think I might know someone," she whispered. He took her hands in his grip warm and steady. "Marjorie Quinn," he said, testing her real name on his tongue, and it sounded like a poem. "Will you do me the honor of becoming Marjorie Kane?" "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, with no lies and no hesitation. "Yes, I will." He pulled her into his arms, and this time, when he kissed her, it wasn't a contract or a question. It was a promise of a new beginning, built not on a lie, but on a truth that was stronger and more beautiful than any of them could have ever imagined. The past was a ghost they had finally laid to rest, and for the first time under the vast Montana sky, the future stretched out before them, endless and golden. If you enjoyed the story of secrets and second chances, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Marjorie's shoes? Until next time, stay safe out there.